All right, we today gonna tackle learning unit 2 CRW 2603. The date today is the 14th of January 2025. We're gonna be dealing with study unit or learning unit 2, which we will divide into two groups. Let's go to learning unit 2. Learning unit 2 is participants to a crime. The time is exactly 12:42 today. Okay, learning outcomes. When you have worked through this study unit, you should be able to demonstrate your understanding of the principles. Something is disturbing me. Okay, let us proceed. Being able to distinguish between a perpetrator and an accomplice. Being able to explain when an accused can be held liable as a perpetrator, be it according to the general principles of criminal liability or by virtue of the operation of the doctrine of common purpose. Being able to recognize a joining in situation and to determine the liability of the joiner in. Being able to explain when an accused can be held liable as an accomplice. Being able to explain when an accused can be held liable as an accessory after the fact. Background. On the module CRW1501, we assumed that only one person has acted in the commission of a crime. However, it is well known that criminals do not always act on their own, but often together with others. In this learning unit, we are going to set out the principles applicable when more than one person is involved in the commission of a crime. Consider the following scenario. Two people whom we will call X and Z decide to rob a cafe. X walks into the cafe, threatens the owner with a revolver, and in his way succeeds to getting possession of the money in the till. Z never goes into the cafe but stands guard outside in order to warn X should he see the police coming. Nobody will deny that X has committed robbery. The question, however, is whether Z can also be convicted of the robbery. If Z is charged with robbery, can he allege that he cannot be convicted of robbery if Z is charged with robbery? Can he allege that he cannot be convicted of a crime because he was never even inside the cafe, never held the revolver, and never even touched the money? It is questions such as these that we will discuss in this learning unit. Introduction. Oh, there's a mishap here. Where is the introduction now? Introduction 2.2. Classification of persons involved in a crime. Joubert chapter 4. We begin the classification to various categories, those persons who may be involved with or implicated in the commission of a crime. We shall first set out the classification in a diagram and then discuss the different categories of persons. And here is the diagram. Here is the diagram. Persons involved in a crime, participant and non-participant. Participants, there is a perpetrator, there is accomplice. Non-participants, accessories after the fact. Then we move. The term persons involved in a crime is used as a general collective term for all the persons or groups of persons involved in the commission of the crime, whether they further the commission of the crime or not, and who consequently can be charged in connection with the commission of the crime. Persons involved in a crime is not a legal term at all. No one is charged or convicted as a person involved in the commission of a crime. It is merely a convenient phrase which we use in order to explain our classification of criminals into different groups. Persons involved in the crime can be subdivided into two categories, namely persons who participate and persons who do not participate. A person involved who participates is briefly described as participant. A participant is anyone who does something in whatever manner whereby he furthers the commission of the crime. On the other hand, a person involved who does not participate is someone who, although he can be described as being involved in a crime, does not further the commission of the crime at all. Okay. Okay. There is only one group of persons that will fall into this category, namely accessories after the fact. An accessory after the fact is someone who, after the crime has already been completed, learns about the crime for the first time, and he does something to protect the perpetrators of the crime or help them to escape criminal liability for their acts. The best example of an excess is after the fact that person who after the murder has committed helps the murderer to dispose of the body by, for instance, throwing it in a river with heavy weight tied around its neck. An accessory after the fact cannot be a participant because his act does not amount to a furthering of the commission of the crime. After all, one cannot further a crime if the crime, like murder in the above mentioned example, has already been committed. In the next learning unit, we shall return to the accessory after the fact and deal with the liability in greater detail. First, however, we shall consider the participant and note that various kinds of participants. The category of persons known as participants can in turn by divided into two subcategories, namely perpetrators and accomplices. The distinction between the perpetrator and accomplice is of the utmost importance, and you must be sure that you fully understand it. Definition of perpetrator and an accomplice. Definition of perpetrator: the person is a perpetrator if his conduct, the circumstances in which it takes place, including, where relevant, a particular description with which he as a person must, according to the definition of the offense, comply, and capability with which it is carried out are such that he satisfies all the requirements for a liability contained in the definition of the offense. Or, although his own conduct does not comply with that required of definition of the crime, he acted together with one or more persons, and the conduct required for conviction is imputed to him by virtue of the principles relating to the doctrine of common purpose. Do not feel discouraged if you do not understand these definitions immediately when reading them for the first time. They will probably strike you as very involved. However, as you proceed with your studies of this learning unit, this definition will become clearer. The doctrine of common purpose mentioned in part 2 above will be discussed in some detail below. The crucial words in the definition, i.e., the words which an examiner is always looking for when he marks the examination purpose are in part 1, conduct, circumstances, and capability, satisfies all the requirements of definition, and in part 2, imputed doctrine of common purpose. Definition of an accomplice. A person is an accomplice if, although he does not comply with all the requirements of liability set out in the definition of a crime, and although the conduct required for the conviction is not imputed for him in terms of the doctrine of common purpose, he engages in a conduct whereby he unlawfully and intentionally furthers the commission of the crime committed by somebody else. The crucial words in this definition are not comply with definition conduct, not imputed in terms of the doctrine of common purpose, further crime. I will stop there for now. All right. We're proceeding 2.2.3, distinction between perpetrator and accomplice. Explained. To determine whether someone is a perpetrator, one must first look at the definition of the particular crime, and second, consider whether the accused conduct, state of mind, and characteristics comply in all aspects with the definition. Murder is an unlawful, intentional causing of death of another. And anyone who, in whatever manner, unlawfully and intentionally causes the death of another person is a perpetrator of the crime of murder. Some crimes can be committed only by people complying with a certain description. For example, in South Africa, high treason can be committed only by a person owing allegiance to the Republic of South Africa. A crime may also be defined in such a way that it can be committed only by a person who has a certain occupation, e.g., medical doctor, or only only by someone who is holder of certain license. What is the position if somebody does not comply with the description, i.e., to owe allegiance, to be a medical doctor, or to be the holder of certain license, but nevertheless commits an act whereby he furthers the commission of a crime by somebody who does comply with such description? The answer is that such a person is an accomplice for the following reasons: because he does not comply with the particular description, he cannot be brought within the definition of the crime, but he nevertheless commits an act whereby he furthers the commission of the crime by somebody else. If a court convicts somebody of a crime without explicitly specifying that he is convicted of being an accomplice to a crime, it normally means that he is convicted as a perpetrator or a co-perpetrator. Perpetrators. Co-perpetrators unnecessary to identify a principal perpetrator. We have seen that a person is a perpetrator if, briefly states, he complies with all the requirements for liability in the definition of the crime, or if the act of somebody else who is a perpetrator is imputed to him in terms of common purpose doctrine. There is no rule in our law stipulating that where more than one person jointly commits a crime, there can only be a single perpetrator, and that the others who aid in the commission of the crime invariably belong to another category. Where there is more than one participant or perpetrator, it is it is not always possible to select one as a principal offender. There is no criteria by which one can, in every case, satisfactorily identify such a principal. In certain cases, a principal offender may be defined, and such a person is then referred to in our legal terminology as a principal offender. But the distinction between the principal offender and other perpetrators is not important for the purpose of liability. However, it can be of great importance in the assessment of punishment. Several persons commit a crime together, and their conduct, state of mind, and characteristics all comply with the definition of the crime. Each one of them is a co-perpetrator. A co-perpetrator does not belong to any category other than that of a perpetrator. Two persons may act in such a way that each contributes equally to the crime, as where A takes the victim by the arms, B takes him by the legs, and they throw him over a cliff. Both are co-perpetrators in the commission of the murder if the conduct of both can be described as unlawful intentional causing of the death. That one is a perpetrator in no way distracts from the fact that the other is a perpetrator. Co-perpetrators, difference between direct and indirect perpetrator irrelevant. Sometimes a distinction can be drawn between the direct and an indirect perpetrator. A direct perpetrator is a perpetrator who commits the crime with his own hands or body. An indirect perpetrator does not commit the crime with his body, but makes use of somebody else to commit the crime. For instance, X hires Z to murder Y. X hires Z to murder Y. If Y himself fires a shot at Y, killing Y, Z is the direct perpetrator, whereas X is the indirect perpetrator. The distinction between the direct and indirect perpetrator is of no significance for the purpose of determining liability. Both X and Z in the above example are guilty of murder as co-perpetrators because the conduct of both falls within the definition of murder. The conduct of both amounts to the unlawful and intentional causing another's death. In the eyes of the law, Z is merely an instrument with which X commits the crime. In the examination, students sometimes asked to explain the difference between the perpetrator and accomplice, and they often make the mistake of writing that a perpetrator is a person who commits the crime with his own hands, whereas the accomplice is somebody who does not commit the crime with his own hands. Such a statement is wrong because a person can be a perpetrator even if he uses another to do his dirty work. for him, as explained in the above example of the hired assassin. Being a perpetrator of a murder by virtue of the doctrine of common purpose. In a number of people acting together kill Y, it is often very difficult to find with certainty that the act committed by each of them contributed causally to Y's death. The facts may be such that there is no doubt that at least one of the group, namely the one who actually shot and killed Y, caused his death. But there are also situations in which not even the conduct of a single one of the group can, without a doubt, be described as a cause, at least in the sense of conditio sine qua non of Y's death. The latter situation occurs especially if there is a large number of people who together kill Y. It may then be difficult to base their liability for the joint murder merely on an application of the general principle of liability. There is usually no difficulty in finding that somebody's conduct was unlawful and that each member of the group entertained the intention to kill. What is, however, often difficult to find is that the individual conduct of each member satisfied the requirement of causation. In order to overcome difficulties such as these, the courts apply a special doctrine to facilitate the conviction of murder of each separate member of the group. The doctrine is known as the doctrine of common purpose. Definition of the doctrine of common purpose. If two or more people having a common purpose to commit a crime act together in order to achieve that purpose, the acts of each of them in the execution of such a purpose are imputed to the others. Although the doctrine of a couched in general terms, in our law it has been applied mostly to the crime of murder. The crucial requirement of the doctrine is that the different accused should have had the same purpose. Once this is proven, the act of Z, who, for example, threw a heavy stone at Y which struck him on the head, is imputed to X, who had a common purpose with Z to kill Y, but who threw a stone at Y which missed him. In fact, Z's act is imputed to everyone who had the same purpose as himself and who actively associated himself with the achievement of the common purpose, even though one cannot construe a causing connection between such parties' act and Y's death. It is, however, only X's act which is imputed to the other party, X, not Z's capability. X's liability is based upon his own capability. Malinga, 1963, SA 692A 694. The common purpose doctrine, as applied to cases of murder, may indeed be regarded as nothing other than the mechanism applied to overcome the difficulties inherent in proving causation where a number of people together kill somebody else. If it is possible to base each participant conviction for murder on the application of general rules of liability, and more particular on the ordinary principles of causation, it is, in our view, preferable to follow this option rather than resort to common purpose doctrine in order to secure conviction. The reason for this predilection is the fear expressed in certain quarters that the latter doctrine, with its wide definition and scope, may in certain circumstances lead to inequitable results. In that somebody who played only a comparative minor role in the events may also be convicted of murder. Proof of existence of common purpose. The existence of common purpose between two or more participants is proved in the following ways. Where there is an express of implied prior agreement to commit an offense, since people most conspire in secret, it is very difficult for the state to prove common purpose based on prior arrangement. Where it was held that common purpose based on prior agreement was not proved in this case. Where no prior agreement can be proven, liability arises from an active association and participation in a common criminal design. The concept of active association is very important. We shall say something more about shortly. Why it is necessary to have such a doctrine? Is this doctrine really necessary? It is not possible for our law to dispense with this doctrine. The answer to the first question is yes. And the second, no. To prove the correctness of these answers, we would like to discuss the following practical problems. Okay, assume that a group of 5 people, who we shall refer to as X1, X2, X3, X4, and X5, throw stones at Y. Y cannot run away from them since he is trapped in a corner between 2 high walls. All the assailants, X1 to X5, have the intention to kill Y. This can be gathered from the fact that they shout loud within hearing distance of one another. Kill him. Some stones hit Y and some miss him. Y dies as a result of stoning. X1 to X5 are all charged with having murdered Y. During the trial, it is impossible for It is impossible for the court to find which of the accused persons threw stones that struck Y and which of them threw stones that missed Y because the event took place very quickly. Stated differently, it is impossible for the court to find beyond reasonable doubt that any of the accused threw a stone that hit Y. Let us assume for the moment that the doctrine of common people did not exist. Would it then have been possible for the court to convict any of the accused of murder? Certainly not, because a court would then be able to convict an accused only if it is proven that the accused threw a stone which separately and together with other stones struck Y with the lethal consequences. However, the court finds it impossible to find beyond reasonable doubt that any of the accused threw a stone that struck Y. Let us proceed one step further. Let us assume that the event were filmed with a video camera and that the slow motion portrayal of the events show that the stone thrown by X3 did indeed strike Y, whereas the stone thrown by X4 happened to miss Y by just about a centimeter. Would it be fair for the court to find one on the ground of evidential material that X3 is guilty but X4 is not? Common sense dictates that it would be grossly unfair not to convict X4 under murder as well. It is in all probability merely coincidental that the one stone struck Y and that the other one missed him by just a centimeter. Or one might add that a stone thrown by, say, X5 struck Y only in the small toe without any serious consequences to his life. Apart from this consideration, it is clear that X1 to X5 all share the same intention, namely to kill Y. It would therefore be unfair to assume that a court may convict an accused only upon proof that stone and stones he threw himself struck Y. If this were the law, criminals would be able to escape the clutches of the law by merely ensuring that they never acted alone, but always in a group. This would lead to absurd results. This is the reason why it's necessary to have a doctrine of common purpose. The judgment of Safansa. The leading case on the doctrine of common purpose is Safasta, 1988 SA 868A. In this case, the facts were the following. A crowd of 100 people attacked Y, who was in his house, by pelting the house with stones, hurling petrol bombs through the windows, catching him as he was fleeing from his burning house, stoning him, pouring petrol over him, and setting him alight. The 6 appellants formed part of the crowd. The court found that their conduct consisted inter alia of grabbing and hold Y, wrestling him throwing stones at him, exhorting the crowd to kill him, forming part of the crowd which attacked him, making petrol bomb, disarming him, and setting his house alight. Appellant Division confirmed the 6 appellants convicts of murder by applying the doctrine of common purpose, since it was clear that they all had the common purpose to kill Y. It was argued on behalf of the accused that they could not be convicted of murder only if the causal connection had been proved between each individual accused conduct and Y's death. However, the court held that where, as in this case, common purpose to kill had been proven, each accused could be convicted of murder without proof of causal connection between each one individual conduct and Y's death. If there is no clear evidence that the participants had agreed beforehand to commit the crime together, the existence of common purpose between the certain participants and others may be proven by the fact that he actively associated himself with the actions of the other members of the group. Active association as a proof of participation in the common purposes. Okay. I think I'm here. Active association as proof of participation in a common purpose. The existence of common purpose between a certain participant and other members of the group may be based upon finding the participant actively associated with the actions for the other members of the group. It happens frequently in practice. In Ngedezi, the appellant division held that if there is no proof of previous agreement between perpetrators and accused whose individual act is not causal related to Y's death, can only be convicted of murder on the strength of the doctrine of common purpose if the following 5 requirements had been complied with. He must have been present at the scene of the crime. He must have been aware of the assault of Y. He must have intended to make common cause with those committing the assault. He must have manifested his sharing of common purpose with himself, performing some act of association with conduct of the others. He must have had the intention to kill Y or to contribute to his death. Thus, somebody who was merely a passive spectator to the event will not, in terms of this doctrine, be liable of conviction even though he may have been present at the scene of the action. Another principle which emerges from the case law is the following. If murder cases active association can result in a liability only if the act of association took place whilst one was still alive and at the stage before the lethal wound had been inflicted by one of the other person. Motawang in 1990. Liability on the basis of active association declared constitutional. In Tebas 2003, liability of murder on the basis of active association with the execution of the common purpose to kill was challenged on the grounds that it unjustifiable limits the constitutional right to dignity, Section 10 of the Constitution. The right to freedom and security of a person, Section 12, subsection 1a, and the right of the accused person to a fair trial, Section 35, subsection 3. The Constitutional Court rejected these arguments and declared constitutional the common law principle which requires mere active association instead of causation as the basis of liability in collaborative criminal enterprises. One of the court's main arguments was the following: the doctrine of common purposes in our criminal justice system. The principal object of the doctrine is to criminalize collective criminal conduct and thus to satisfy the need to control crime committed in the course of joint enterprises. In consequence, it is often difficult to prove in crimes such as murder that the act of each person or of the particular person in the group contributed causally to the criminal results. Insisting on the causal relationship would make prosecution of collective criminal enterprises ineffectual. Effective prosecution of crime is a legitimate pressing social need. Thus, there was no objection to the norm of liability introduced by requirement of active association, even though it bypasses the requirement of causation. Paragraph 40 at 343 F 343B. Joining in. Assume that X acting either alone or together with others in the execution of a common purpose has already wounded Y lethally. Thereafter, while Y is still alive, Z, who has not previously agreed with X to kill Y, inflicts a wound on Y, which however does not hasten Y's death. Thereafter, Y dies as a result of the wound inflicted by X. The person in Z's position is referred to as a joiner in because he joined the group and attacked the victim at the stage where Y lethal would have already been inflicted, although Y was then, i.e. when Z joined the assault, still alive. In order to characterize the join-in situation properly, it is important to bear the following in mind. The joining in situation presupposes the absence of common purpose between X and Y. Thus, to summarize, the joiner is a person who attacked Y, did not hasten Y's death, whose blow was administered at the time when Y was still alive, who did not act with common purpose together with the other persons who also inflicted wounds on Y. Note that the joiner in is not a description of a category of participants other than perpetrators and accomplices. It is mere a convenient term to use when referring to the person Z as described in the scenario above. In 1990, in Motawong, the appellate division ruled that the joiner in could not be convicted of murder, but only of attempted murder because he did not casually further the commission of the crime of murder, the killing of Y. The judgment of Motawong is now an authoritative judgment on the liability of a joiner in. The most important principles relating to common purpose. We are now proceeding to summarize the most important principles relating to the doctrine of common purpose, as well as the liability of the joiner in. Make sure that you know these principles very well. Okay, let's go. If two or more people having common purpose to commit crime acting together in order to achieve that purpose, the acts of each of them in the execution of such a purpose are imputed to the others. In the case of charge of having committed crime which involves the causing of certain results such as murder, the conduct imputed includes the causing of such a result. Conduct by a member of the group person having common purposes which differs from the conduct envisaged in the said common purpose may not imputed to another member of the group unless the latter knew that such other conduct would be committed or foresaw the possibility that it might be committed and reconcile himself to that possibility. In finding the person acted together with one or more persons in a common purpose may be based upon proof of the prior arrangement or proof of active association in the execution of the common purpose. On the charge of murder, the rule that liability may be based on active association applies only if the active association took place while the deceased was still alive and before the mortal wound or mortal wounds had been inflicted by a person or a person who commenced the assault. Just as active association with common purpose may lead to liability, so disassociation or withdrawal from the common purpose may, in certain circumstances, lead to non-liability. I'm done with this section now. Thank you. All right, we're proceeding. We ended up here on number 6. Now there is an activity that we're going to do later. Let's proceed. Accomplices, page 18. Accomplices. Just a second. We just want to finish unit 2. 2.4 Accomplices. Introduction. it is necessary to explain accomplice liability in more detail. Where a person does not participate in the commission of a crime as a perpetrator, he may nevertheless participate in the crime and be liable as an accomplice. The definition of each crime is directed primarily at the perpetrator, and the perpetrator is the person whose conduct conforms to all the elements contained in the definition of the crime in question, or who qualifies as a perpetrator. In terms of common purpose doctrine, the accomplice is a person whose conduct does not conform to all requirements in the definition of a crime, but whose conduct is nonetheless punishable because he intentionally furthered the commission of the crime by another person. Liability as an accomplice is therefore less than liability as a perpetrator. See our discussion above on the distinction between the perpetrator and accomplices. Definition. See definition of accomplice in 1.2.2 above. Requirements for liability as an accomplice. In order to be liable as an accomplice, the following 4 requirements must be complied with. 1. Act. There must be an act in the criminal law sense of word by which the commission of a crime by another person is furthered or promoted. Furtherance can take place by way of aiding, counseling, encouraging, or ordering. Merely to be a spectator at the commission of a crime naturally does not amount to furtherance thereof. The following are examples of conduct for which a person has been held liable as an accomplice. In Pierre and Lalo 1906 TS 798, the conduct forbidden in the definition of the crime was the purchase of unwrought gold. Lalo bought the gold and was thus a perpetrator. Pekan bought no gold but acted as interpreter, advisor, and surety in connection with the transaction. Consequently, his conduct did not comply with the definition of a crime, the purchaser of gold, but nonetheless constituted furtherance of the purchase. Accordingly, he was an accomplice. In Kazi, 1968, 4SA 742, the forbidden conduct was the holding or organizing a meeting without the necessary permission. K did not hold or organize the meeting but nonetheless addressed it. It was held that his conduct rendered him guilty as an accomplice. Unlawfulness. The act of furthering as described above must be unlawful. In other words, there must not be any justification Okay. The unlawfulness. The act of feathering as described above must be unlawful. In other words, there must not be any justification for it, such as compulsion. Intention. The crime committed by another person must be feathered intentionally. Quanta 1974, negligence is not sufficient. The shop assistant who advertently fails to close the shop window is not an accomplice to the housebreaking which follows. He will be an accomplice if knowing of the intended housebreaking and in order to help the thief does not close the window properly. In such a case, the thief need not be aware of the shop's clerk assistance. It is therefore sufficient if the accomplice intentionally feathers the crime. It is not required that the perpetrator must have been conscious of the accomplice's assistance. Mutual conscious cooperation is therefore not a requirement. Accessory character of liability. A crime must have been committed by some other person. Liability as an accomplice is known as accessory liability. No person can be held liable as an accomplice unless some other person is guilty as a perpetrator. Accessories after the fact. Introduction. As was pointed out above, an accessory after the fact is not a participant because he does not feather the crime. He comes into the picture only after the crime has been committed and then helps the perpetrator to escape justice. Examples of the conduct of the accessory after the fact are the following. X helped real murderer by throwing the corpse into the river. Z murdered Y. After the murder, X and Z removed certain parts of Y's body and thereafter disposed the body by leaving it in a lonely spot at the top of a mountain. X had nothing to do with the murder but was convicted of being an accessory after the fact in respect of the murder. There's a case Mafungu 1981. Definition. The person is an accessory after the fact to the commission of a crime if after the commission of a crime he unlawfully and intentionally engaged in a conduct intended to enable the perpetrator of or accomplice to the crime to evade liability of his crime or to facilitate such person's evasion of liability. Requirements for liability of accessory after the fact. In order to be convicted of being accessory after the fact, the following 6 requirements must be complied with. Act or commission. The accessory after the fact must engage in a conduct, act or omission where he assists either the perpetrator or the accomplice to evade liability. Mere approval or condonation of a crime is not enough. Mere approval or condonation of a crime is not enough. It is possible for a person to be an accessory after the fact on the ground of an omission. This will be the case if there is a legal duty upon such a person to act positively. An example in this respect is where a police officer sees that the crime has been committed but intentionally remains passive because he wants to protect the criminal who committed the crime from detection. The merely approval or ratification of a crime after its commission is insufficient to construe a person as being an accessory after the fact to its commission. After the commission of the crime, act or omission must take place after the commission of the actual crime. If act takes place at the time when the crime is still in the processing of being committed, he may qualify as a co-perpetrator or accomplice. If X had agreed prior to the commission of a crime to render assistance, X may, depending on the circumstances, be a perpetrator himself if his conduct, capability, and personal qualities accord with the definition of the crime, or else he may be an accomplice. Enabling perpetrator or accomplice to evade liability, the act must be of the certain nature. It must be such that it assists the perpetrator or accomplice to evade liability for her crime, or to facilitate such person's evasion of liability. It is not required that the protection or assistance given be successful. One would therefore be guilty as an accessory after the fact, even though the corpse which one helped to conceal by submerging in a river is discovered by the police and fished out of the river, and the murderer is brought to justice. Unlawfulness. The act must be unlawful, which means that there must be no justification for it. Intention. The accessory after the fact must render assistance intentionally. He must know that the person he is helping has committed the crime. He must have the intention to assist the perpetrator or accomplice to evade liability or to facilitate the evasion of liability. Here is the case number Morgan 1992. Accessory character of liability. The liability of the accessory after the fact, like that of an accomplice, is an accessory in character. They can only be an accessory after the fact if somebody else has committed the crime as a perpetrator. As a result, one cannot be an accessory after the fact to a crime committed by oneself. Reasons for existence questionable. In conclusion, it may be asked whether the crime of being an accessory after the fact is really necessary in our law. In our opinion, is not. Being an accessory after the fact completely overlaps with the crime known as defeating or obstructing the course of justice. A crime which we will discuss briefly further on in this guide. Summary. Okay. Persons involved in the commission of a crime are divided into two groups, namely the participants and the non-participants. The participants further the commission of a crime, whereas non-participants do not further the commission of the crime. An accessory after the fact is a non-participant since he comes into the picture only after the crime has already been completed, and then helps the perpetrator or the accomplice to escape liability. Participants are divided into two groups, namely perpetrator and accomplice. The distinction drawn between the two is the most important decision relating to the participants in the crime. Consult the definition of a perpetrator and accomplice given above. Unlike a perpetrator, an accomplice does not, through his conduct, state of mind, or personal description, fall in the definition of a crime, but nevertheless commits an act whereby he furthers the commission of the crime by somebody else. If one considers the definition of a perpetrator, it is clear that there are two grounds upon which a person can qualify as a perpetrator, namely either on the ground that he complies with the definition of the crime, in which the case one merely applies the ordinary principle of liability, and in a murder, more particularly, only the ordinary principle relating to causation, or by virtue of the operation of doctrine of common purpose. As far as the doctrine of common purpose as well as the liability of the joiner in a consent, consult with the summary above, the 1.3.5 of the most important principles applicable to this topic. The conduct of an accomplice amounts to a furthering of the crime by somebody else. Furthering includes rendering assistance, giving advice, encouraging, and so forth. An accomplice is guilty only if he furthers the crime unlawfully and intentionally. A person cannot be an accomplice unless somebody else is a perpetrator. An accessory after the fact is not a participant because he does not further. An accessory after the fact is not a participant because he does not further the crime. In order to be liable as an accessory after the fact, the person must render assistance intentional to somebody who has already committed the crime as a perpetrator or as an accomplice. Okay, and then we test ourselves here, and then we go to learning unit 3. We're done with this one. Learning unit 2 of CRW 2603.